My name is Marc Klaas. That's Marcklaas, and I am the founder of the Klaas Kids Foundation.
Tell me a little bit about the foundation.
Well, the Klaas Kids Foundation was formed in 1994 in the aftermath of the kidnap, rape, and murder of my daughter, Polly Klaas. We started the foundation to give meaning to her death and also to hopefully protect other children that might find themselves in her situation or similar situations. So our mission statement is to stop crimes against children.
And for our story, what capacity, what credentials would you like to be addressed as?
Just as the founder of the foundation.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the situation out here in Kern County with the two missing boys, 3-year-old Orson and 4-year-old Oren West, can you give me a little bit of context of how your family was struck with such a tragedy as well?
Well, sure. It was on the evening of October 1st, 1993, that my 12-year-old daughter, Polly, was hosting a slumber party in the home that she shared with her mother in Petaluma, California. She was hosting the party with 2 of her girlfriends. And at about 10:30 at night, as the girls were going to prepare to go to bed, Polly opened the bedroom door and there was a knife-wielding stranger standing there. And he said, "If you make a noise, I'll slit your throats." He then proceeded to tie, bind, and gag Polly's girlfriends and basically steal Polly into the night. Her last words were, "Please don't hurt my mother and sister," who happened to be sleeping in the next bedroom. And it took the girls about 15 minutes to extricate themselves. They contacted law enforcement, and that launched a 65-day investigation into what happened to Polly. And we found, ultimately, that she had been taken by a recently released serial predator named Richard Allen Davis, who in fact had been released from prison for his second kidnapping 3 months before she disappeared. And that character now resides on California's death row. Not that that means anything at this point.
And since then, from my understanding, you've dedicated your life to, you made a huge transition in your life from the business you were operating to the front of missing children and policies around that. Can you explain your journey a little bit to me?
Well, it's a pretty hard journey to explain, but basically I found, as we were looking for Polly during those 65 days, that I was provided with very good information from law enforcement, that I had turned myself into an effective advocate for missing children, and really realized that there was nobody else doing that job in society, at least nobody that had any kind of a profile that was getting the attention of anybody that cared or mattered. So with the support of my wife, I launched into that, starting the Klaas Kids Foundation, and got very fortunate. I mean, goodness, I was able to visit the White House on numerous occasions. You know, we became well known to the President Clinton at that time, worked with a lot of governors around the country, first pursuing things like Megan's Law. Megan's Law being the sex offender registry that gives the public information about those individuals that live in their neighborhoods, then ultimately into the Amber Alert and various other pieces of legislation that I think really worked to protect children from the predators that were in existence then. And we then started on an internet campaign. We started a search and rescue team, which is still very viable. In fact, we just had our busiest year in search and rescue in 2020, which goes against the grain. I mean, nothing seemed to happen in 2020 except COVID, but still there were a lot of kids that were being reported missing. And so we're 27 years into this experiment right now, and still going strong.
And I think your experience and your advocacy, as seen, across all media, a lot of media platforms have had has influenced a lot of positive change when it comes to policy and efforts to make sure that these type of things are, from all fronts, organized in the search, that there, Megan's law, that there's a database for sex offenders. I understand there's the three strikes rule also followed the situation. Was that directly related to
Polly and our crime? Well, in a way it was. I mean, it was the three strikes movement was started by a guy named Mike Reynolds in Fresno. And Mike started the three strikes movement after the murder of his daughter in Fresno back in 1992. It was really getting absolutely no traction, though, until we found out what had happened to Polly, because the contrast was so great. I mean, a sweet little girl in her own home, minding her own business, was invaded by a monster who never should have been out on the street. And when people made that connection, the three strikes petition absolutely took off, and it got millions of signatures. Every politician in the state got behind three strikes, and by February of 1994, 2 months after Polly was kidnapped, it had been passed into law by the legislature, and that November it was passed into law by a petition. Anyway, it was passed into law by the people. And throughout the 10 or 15 years, I think that three strikes was really effective. It really totally helped to reduce crime in the state of California, both violent crime and property crime, by about 50%. So it was a very good law, a very effective law, and one that has been misrepresented by politicians ever since. And unfortunately, now it's just sort of a shadow of what it really was.
And since what happened to Polly, you've spoken to a lot of different families who've experienced their children and their loved ones going missing. And you've delved yourself into a lot of communities that have been struck by this tragedy as well. In California City, there's two missing boys that you and I have spoken about in the past on the Nancy Gray Show.
Yeah.
3-year-old Orson, 4-year-old Oren West. They disappeared from their backyard, according to their adoptive parents. And you know some of the details of this case. Is there? What do you make of it?
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. First of all, this type of abduction, the type of abduction that Polly went through, a stereotypical stranger abduction, is very, very rare. Less than 1% of all abductions occur this way. But then when you break it down into two little children as opposed to one little child, you've got double the trouble. Whoever's got the kids is going to have to somehow or another mollify two children and keep two children under control as opposed to one child. And I think we all understand when children are that young, it's not easy to do that. And then what's the motive? Why in the world would somebody take these kids? I mean, if you start breaking this down, you're going to probably find a small subsection of possible individuals who are involved. In other words, it's not a community that people come in and out of a lot. It's not a community that strangers actually go to. It's a remote community and a small community that's got a very finite population. And one would have to look towards that population, I believe, in order to solve this mystery.
And you were telling me a little bit about the aftermath of the investigation immediately following Polly going missing. We know that in this case, the California City Police Department asked the adoptive parents and many others close to the investigation to submit to a polygraph. The police chief of the California City Police Department didn't tell me whether they actually took the test or not, but there are no suspects named. There are no persons of interest. But with that, in your experience, being the father of Polly Klaas, were you also asked to submit to a polygraph? What was that experience like?
Well, I was as upfront with law enforcement as I could be from the very beginning. I made a very conscious decision not to get an attorney involved because I wanted to be able to be a spokesperson for myself and for my child. And they told me up front that in the vast majority of these kinds of cases, family members are involved, and the best way I can serve Polly's situation is to clear myself from suspicion. And I told them that whatever it would take to do that, they could interrogate me as long as they wanted about anything they wanted. They could give me a polygraph, which they ultimately did. And I was able to eliminate myself early enough so that they could then take the vast resource. And when the FBI comes into a case, it does bring vast resource and knowledge with it. So they could then take that and direct it into other areas. They could focus on other family members, perhaps. They could focus on friends and acquaintances of the family. They could focus on the registered sex offenders that lived within the community, who the public was not aware of at that time, only that there were some of these shady people out there somewhere. And so that they could even take a look at people that made deliveries to the home, the mailman, anybody that could have some kind of a tangential relationship with these kids one way or another. And then hopefully they continue to eliminate until they finally found the guy that actually committed the crime. All of that makes great sense in theory. But if you're dealing with a true stranger abduction, it's going to be very, very difficult, short of finding the child or finding some, very specific evidence to make the case one way or other as to what had happened to that child. I think we were fortunate because after 2 months, somebody wandered upon a crime scene on property that they owned, and that ultimately resulted in figuring out who had taken Polly, going and making the arrest on that individual, and ultimately recovering Polly's remains. So I guess the short answer is you listen to the cops, you do as many media interviews as you can possibly do, get people invested in the case, get people to understand and know the children, so that all eyes are out there looking for the kids. And with some luck and some great investigation, they'll be able to bring a resolution, whatever that may be.
So in your journey, you've noticed, in your experience, I should say, that one of the rules of thumb when your kids go missing is to do as many media interviews as possible. Is that true?
Well, I believe that's true, and I also believe that the people that should be doing those interviews are family members, are the parents of the missing kids, because they're the ones that are going to be able to get out there, make the best case, get people to understand who these children were, share information about the children, and hopefully enlist the public in being invested in bringing the kids home. Now, I know in a lot of cases the parents may not speak very good English, or they may have other barriers that they're dealing with, so somebody else might come in and be a spokesperson on behalf of the family. But I always believe that the family is the best resource in these kinds of situations.